At my son's wedding, they replaced my seat with a trash can and told me not to be so dramatic. Margaret Whitmore stood at the entrance of the Grand Harbor Ballroom in Stamford, Connecticut, her gloved hands resting lightly on her silver clutch as guests filtered past her in silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. The string quartet, playing softly near the tall windows that overlooked the Long Island Sound, and for a brief, fragile moment she allowed herself to believe the day would heal the quiet distance that had grown between her and her only son over the past 2 years. She had arrived early, just as she always did, wearing a navy blue dress she had carefully pressed that morning, the one her late husband Thomas used to say made her look dignified and strong. And in her purse was a cream envelope containing a cashier's check for $25,000, the final contribution she had promised toward Daniel's wedding expenses, a gesture she hoped would show support rather than obligation. She followed the calligraphed seating chart near the reception doors, scanning for her name with a polite, restrained smile. But instead of finding Margaret Whitmore, mother of the groom, placed near the head table, her eyes settled on a small metal trash receptacle positioned at the far edge of the room, near the catering station. A folded place card taped to its lid that read, "Reserved for the emotional guest." For a few seconds, she simply stared, certain she had misunderstood, certain that there had been some clerical mistake, but the laughter behind her confirmed otherwise. Chloe Bennett, radiant in white satin and flawless makeup, approached with 2 bridesmaids trailing behind her, and said lightly, "It's just a joke, Margaret. Don't be so dramatic." As though replacing a mother's chair with a trash can were the same as a misplaced napkin or an extra fork. Daniel stood a few feet away, adjusting his cufflinks, his jaw tight, his eyes skimming past his mother as if she were another vendor who had arrived too early. Margaret felt the air shift around her, not hot with anger but cold with realization, the kind that settles deep in the chest and makes everything painfully clear. She did not argue. She did not cry. Instead, she lifted the place card from the trash can, smoothed the crease with steady fingers, and handed it back to Chloe without a word, then quietly asked a catering assistant if there was a spare folding chair available, her voice calm, almost pleasant, as though she were requesting extra coffee at a church luncheon. The assistant hesitated before retrieving a simple metal chair from storage, and Margaret placed it herself along the back wall, away from the bridal party, but still within view of the dance floor. Throughout the ceremony she applauded at the right moments, smiled for photographs when prompted, and accepted polite compliments from distant relatives who pretended not to notice where she was seated, all while observing the careful choreography of the evening, the way Chloe told guests that she and Daniel had handled everything on their own, the way Daniel repeated that phrase with a rehearsed nod. Margaret kept her posture straight and her expression composed, understanding that humiliation delivered publicly is meant to provoke a spectacle, and that refusing to provide one is its own quiet form of resistance. As the first dance began and the chandeliers cast a warm glow across the polished marble floor, she realized that the seat they had taken from her was not just a chair at a wedding, but a symbol of something far deeper, and for the first time that evening she felt not wounded but awakened. Margaret remained seated in the narrow metal chair long after dinner plates had been cleared, her hands folded neatly in her lap as waiters moved between tables carrying slices of layered white cake and fluted glasses filled with sparkling cider. And although music and laughter swelled around her, she felt as if she were watching the evening through a pane of glass that separated her from the rest of the room. She noticed how Chloe circled the guests with effortless confidence, accepting compliments about the floral arrangements and the waterfront venue, repeating that she and Daniel had worked tirelessly to create such a perfect evening, and each time she said it, Daniel nodded in agreement, as though the months Margaret had spent reviewing vendor contracts and covering deposits had quietly dissolved into nothing. When an elderly cousin approached Margaret and asked why she was seated so far from the head table, she simply smiled and replied that she preferred to observe from a distance, her tone light, her back straight, refusing to offer anyone the satisfaction of witnessing her discomfort. The envelope in her purse felt heavier than it had earlier, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, and she found herself remembering a different ballroom more than 35 years earlier when she and Thomas had danced beneath paper lanterns at their own modest reception, a celebration paid for in installments and goodwill rather than extravagance. and she recalled how Thomas had insisted that his mother sit beside them, saying that respect was not optional but foundational. The memory did not bring tears, only clarity. As speeches began, Chloe's father thanked family and friends for supporting the couple, carefully naming those who had contributed time and effort. Yet Margaret's name did not cross his lips, and Daniel did not correct the omission. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he thanked his bride for teaching him independence and for encouraging him to build a life defined by his own choices. And Margaret listened closely to the subtle implication woven into his words, the suggestion that independence required distance from the woman who had raised him. Around her, guests dabbed at their eyes and lifted their glasses in applause, unaware of the quiet shift taking place inside the mother seated against the wall. She did not interrupt. She did not leave. Instead, she studied her son's face, noticing the tension behind his smile, the way his gaze avoided the corner where she sat, and she understood that humiliation often thrives on silence from bystanders more than cruelty from the instigator. As the evening moved toward dancing and the lights dimmed to a warm amber glow, Margaret rose slowly from the folding chair, smoothing the fabric of her dress with deliberate care, and stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the dark water. The October air carried a faint chill, sharp and honest, unlike the sweetness inside, and she inhaled deeply, allowing the sound of distant waves to steady her thoughts. She realized then that the evening had revealed more than it had concealed, and that sometimes the clearest understanding of one's place in a family comes not from words spoken in affection, but from gestures delivered in mockery. And as she stood beneath the string lights flickering against the night sky, she felt something inside her settle into quiet resolve rather than sorrow. Margaret remained on the terrace until the final song drifted through. The ballroom doors and guests began collecting their coats, and when she finally stepped back inside, the energy of the room had shifted from ceremony to celebration. Laughter louder, ties loosened, high heels kicked off beneath linen-covered tables. Yet she moved through the space with quiet steadiness, offering congratulations to Daniel and Chloe as though the evening had unfolded without incident. Chloe thanked her with a polished smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and Daniel embraced his mother briefly, the gesture careful and measured, as if affection itself required permission, and Margaret noticed how quickly he turned back toward his new wife once the cameras lifted again. She handed Daniel the cream envelope without ceremony, explaining in a calm voice that it contained the remaining amount she had promised, and he accepted it with a distracted nod, saying they would put it toward the honeymoon in Italy, a 2-week trip along the Amalfi Coast that Chloe had described repeatedly over the past year. Margaret wished them safe travels and stepped aside as another group of friends surrounded the couple, her presence fading into the background of the reception hall that she had helped finance. The drive home to Westport took just under 40 minutes, and she kept the radio off, preferring the steady hum of the engine and the dark stretch of Interstate 95 illuminated by evenly spaced headlights. When she arrived at the colonial house she had shared with Thomas for more than 3 decades, she paused in the driveway before turning off the ignition, looking at the front porch light that she had left on out of habit, and for the first time that evening she allowed herself to replay the image of the metal trash receptacle positioned where her chair should have been. She did not cry. Instead, she walked inside, hung her coat neatly in the hallway closet, and placed her clutch on the console table beneath the framed family photographs that documented birthdays, graduations, and holidays from years when she had believed that loyalty was permanent. In the quiet of the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water and sat at the oak table Thomas had refinished by hand, tracing the faint lines in the wood as memories surfaced with surprising precision, moments when Chloe had gently insisted on separate holidays, separate traditions, separate financial arrangements, always framed as modern boundaries, always delivered with soft language that disguised their impact. Margaret began to recognize the pattern more clearly now, how small exclusions accumulate over time until they solidify into something undeniable. She rose from the table and walked to the study at the back of the house, unlocking the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk where important documents were stored in labeled folders, and she removed the leather-bound portfolio that contained the estate plans she and Thomas had drafted years earlier with careful foresight. She sat down beneath the soft glow of the desk lamp and reviewed the pages slowly, not searching for revenge, but for understanding, realizing that respect, once diminished publicly, requires thoughtful response rather than impulsive reaction. As midnight approached and the house settled into silence, Margaret closed the portfolio and rested her hands upon it, aware that the events of the evening had drawn a clear line between what had been tolerated and what would be addressed. And for the first time since stepping into that ballroom, she felt not like a sidelined guest, but like a woman preparing to reclaim her position with quiet deliberation. Margaret did not sleep much that night. Yet by 7 o'clock the next morning she was dressed in a soft gray cardigan and standing at the kitchen counter, measuring coffee grounds with the same steady precision she had used for decades, the routine grounding her as sunlight filtered through the bay window and illuminated the quiet street outside. The house felt unchanged, the ticking wall clock consistent, the faint scent of lemon polish lingering from her weekly cleaning, and she found comfort in the ordinary details that had not shifted with a single evening spectacle. After breakfast, she carried the leather-bound portfolio into the study again and placed it carefully on the desk, opening to the section she and Thomas had once reviewed with their attorney, Harrison Cole, during a long afternoon conversation about legacy, dignity, and the responsibility that accompanies inheritance. Thomas had insisted on including a clause about family conduct, explaining that financial gift should reinforce values rather than reward disregard. And at the time Margaret had smiled at his seriousness, believing such precautions unnecessary within a loving household. Now, as she read the language line by line, she recognized that foresight is often mistaken for pessimism until it becomes protection. She recalled how, over the past 3 years, Chloe had gradually shifted conversations about money into conversations about independence, encouraging Daniel to view shared assets as obstacles to growth, suggesting that true adulthood meant building a life untouched by parental influence. And while Margaret had respected their desire for autonomy, she also noticed how autonomy seemed to apply selectively when wedding deposits were due or when closing costs on their new condominium in Greenwich required additional support. Each request had been framed politely, accompanied by reassurances that it would be temporary, yet the pattern now appeared more deliberate than incidental. Around 10:30, she placed a call to Harrison Cole's office, requesting a meeting at his earliest convenience, her tone calm and professional, offering no explanation beyond the need to review certain provisions. She then opened her laptop and examined recent bank statements, confirming the transfers she had made over the past 12 months, the figures substantial, yet given without resentment at the time, and she made careful notes beside each entry, not as evidence for confrontation, but as a record for clarity. As the day progressed, she walked through the rooms of the house with measured reflection, pausing at the staircase where Daniel had once waited nervously for his first school bus, remembering the evenings she had stayed awake while he studied for college entrance exams, the countless small sacrifices that had felt invisible because they were made in love. The contrast between those memories and the image of a metal container labeled as her place at a family celebration did not ignite anger so much as sharpen understanding. By late afternoon she sat again at the study desk, folding the portfolio closed with deliberate care, and she recognized that what had occurred in that ballroom was not an isolated misstep, but a public confirmation of a gradual repositioning that had been unfolding quietly for years. Margaret understood that silence can preserve dignity, yet action can restore balance. And as she prepared a simple dinner for herself that evening, setting a single plate at the table Thomas had built, she felt a steady resolve take shape, not to create conflict, but to redefine terms with the same composure she had displayed under chandeliers and string lights the night before. 3 days after the wedding, Margaret sat across from Harrison Cole in his corner office overlooking downtown Stamford, the autumn sunlight reflecting off glass towers and casting long, clean lines across the polished conference table, and she explained the situation without embellishment, describing the seating change, the public remark, and the gradual pattern that had preceded it, her voice steady, her posture composed, as though she were discussing an administrative matter rather than a personal wound. Harrison listened carefully, folding his hands before him, and when she finished he asked only one question: whether she believed the incident reflected a misunderstanding or a deliberate message, and Margaret answered with measured clarity that she no longer confused repetition with accident. He nodded and turned the portfolio toward himself, reviewing the clause Thomas had insisted upon years earlier, the one outlining expectations of conduct tied to the family trust. And he reminded her that the provision allowed for discretionary adjustments if a beneficiary demonstrated public disregard for foundational values, including dignity and respect toward immediate family. Margaret did not smile, but she felt a quiet affirmation settle inside her, not because she sought punishment, but because structure existed where she had once relied solely on goodwill. They discussed options in practical terms, including a temporary suspension of discretionary distributions that had been informally extended over the past year to assist with Daniel and Chloe's condominium purchase and ongoing living expenses, and Harrison clarified that such support had never been automatic, only permissive. Margaret reviewed her notes, the figures precise, the transfers documented, and she recognized how easily generosity can be reframed as obligation when left undefined. By the end of the meeting, she instructed Harrison to draft a formal notice outlining a review of all current and future financial contributions pending reassessment of compliance with trust guidelines, and she requested that the language remain factual, free of emotion, grounded entirely in documented events. As she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the cool October air felt bracing rather than harsh, and she walked 2 blocks to a small cafe she and Thomas had once frequented on Saturdays, ordering tea and sitting near the window where she could observe the steady rhythm of pedestrians crossing at the light. She did not dwell on humiliation. Instead, she considered alignment, the importance of ensuring that actions reflect stated values, and she understood that maintaining silence in the ballroom had preserved her composure, but measured action now would preserve her legacy. Later that afternoon, she returned home and organized the study desk, placing copies of relevant documents into labeled folders, each movement deliberate, each paper aligned squarely at the edges, and she felt no rush, no urgency, only clarity. Daniel and Chloe were scheduled to depart for Italy the following morning, and Margaret knew the timing would mean they would receive correspondence while abroad, yet she harbored no desire to disrupt their celebration. Rather, she intended to establish boundaries that would remain long after honeymoon photographs faded. As evening settled over Westport and porch lights flickered on along the quiet street, she prepared a simple meal and set a single place at the table, aware that independence, when chosen thoughtfully, carries a different weight than independence declared publicly at another's expense, and she sensed that the coming days would reveal not only their reaction, but their character. Daniel and Chloe landed in Rome on a bright Sunday morning, and by the time their luggage was wheeled through the marble lobby of their hotel overlooking the Tiber River, an electronic notification from Harrison Cole's office had already reached Daniel's inbox, marked formal and time-sensitive, its subject line neutral, yet unmistakably deliberate. Margaret did not know the exact hour they would open it, but she imagined the moment clearly, the subtle shift in expression as Daniel read the language outlining a review of discretionary distributions tied to the Whitmore family trust, the reminder that recent conduct would be evaluated under established guidelines, and the notice that all pending financial support, including contributions toward real estate expenses and travel reimbursements, would remain suspended until further assessment. That afternoon, while the couple explored cobblestone streets and photographed ornate fountains, Margaret remained at home in Westport, watering the hydrangeas along the front walkway and trimming a few yellowed leaves from the rosebush Thomas had planted years earlier, her movements unhurried, her thoughts steady rather than anxious. She had no desire to intrude upon their honeymoon with calls or emotional messages. She understood that silence often amplifies clarity more effectively than argument. Late that evening, as Connecticut moved toward dusk, her phone vibrated once on the kitchen counter, Daniel's name appearing across the screen, and she allowed it to ring twice before answering, her greeting warm but measured. Daniel's voice carried confusion first, then frustration, and finally a cautious restraint as he asked about the notice, suggesting that it must be a misunderstanding, that perhaps someone had misinterpreted the wedding situation, and Margaret listened without interruption, hearing in his tone the faint echo of the ballroom speech about independence. When he paused, she responded evenly that the trust had always included standards of mutual respect, that generosity was never unconditional, and that public disregard carries consequences when tied to shared resources. her words precise, free of accusation. Daniel attempted to minimize the incident, repeating that it had been intended as humor. Yet Margaret asked gently whether humor that isolates a mother in front of 200 guests truly aligns with the values he wished to model in his marriage, and the silence that followed traveled clearly across thousands of miles. She explained that the review was procedural, not punitive, and that future support would depend on demonstrated understanding rather than defensiveness, and she wished him a pleasant remainder of his trip before ending the call. Afterward, she returned the phone to the counter and resumed preparing a simple dinner, slicing tomatoes from her small garden and arranging them neatly on a white plate, noticing that her hands remained steady. Outside, the porch light flickered on automatically as twilight settled, and Margaret understood that boundaries, once established, often reveal more about character than confrontation ever could, and as she sat alone at the oak table beneath the soft glow of the overhead fixture, she felt neither triumph nor regret, only the quiet assurance that dignity, when defended thoughtfully, restores balance without raising a voice. Daniel called again 2 evenings later, his voice no longer edged with immediate frustration, but tempered by the careful restraint of someone beginning to understand that certain decisions carry weight beyond the moment in which they were made. And Margaret listened from her kitchen in Westport, while rinsing a teacup beneath warm water, the steady sound grounding her as he explained that he and Chloe had discussed the matter at length. He said they had not intended harm, that the seating arrangement had been conceived as light-hearted humor among friends, yet he admitted that the reaction from a few guests afterward suggested it had not been received as universally amusing as they had assumed. Margaret did not interrupt. She placed the cup gently in the drying rack and dried her hands on a linen towel before responding, her tone even, her words deliberate. She told him that intention does not erase impact, and that respect, once publicly diminished, requires more than private explanation. She reminded him that the trust had been structured not as entitlement, but as stewardship, designed to support growth while preserving the values his father had considered essential, and she asked him whether he believed those values had been upheld that evening. Daniel hesitated, and in the quiet pause that followed, Margaret sensed not rebellion but reflection. He said that Chloe felt embarrassed by the reaction and believed the situation had been exaggerated, yet he conceded that he had not intervened when he could have, and that omission weighed on him now more than the original decision. Margaret acknowledged his honesty without offering comfort that would dilute accountability, explaining that leadership within a marriage includes protecting those who have supported it, not distancing from them for the sake of appearance. After the call ended, she walked into the study and reviewed the draft correspondence Harrison had prepared outlining next steps, including a formal review meeting to be scheduled upon Daniel and Chloe's return from Italy, where expectations could be clarified and, if appropriate, support gradually reinstated under defined conditions. She appreciated the precision of the language, its neutrality, its reliance on documented facts rather than emotional interpretation. The following morning, she attended her regular book club at the Westport Library, engaging in discussion about historical biography with measured interest. And although a few members inquired gently about the wedding, she summarized it simply as eventful, declining to elaborate or invite sympathy. On her way home, she stopped at the grocery store, selecting fresh salmon and asparagus for dinner, moving through familiar aisles with quiet composure, aware that daily routines often provide stability when relationships shift. That evening, she sat at the oak table once more, reviewing a small leather-bound notebook where she had begun outlining the principles she intended to articulate at the upcoming meeting: clarity over accusation, boundaries over bitterness, restoration over retaliation. As darkness settled beyond the kitchen window and the house grew still, Margaret recognized that the coming conversation would not revolve around a chair or a misplaced joke, but around alignment between declared independence and demonstrated respect, and she felt prepared to speak not as a wounded guest from a ballroom, but as the steward of a legacy built on consistency rather than spectacle. Daniel and Chloe returned from Italy on a cool Thursday evening, their social media filled with photographs of sunlit coastlines and carefully plated pasta. Yet beneath the curated images lingered the unresolved weight of the notice waiting at home. And 2 days later they sat across from Margaret in Harrison Cole's office, the atmosphere measured and professional rather than tense. Margaret had chosen a charcoal suit and a simple pearl necklace, her expression composed as she listened while Harrison outlined the purpose of the meeting, explaining that the review of discretionary distributions was not permanent but contingent upon mutual understanding of the trust's guiding principles. Daniel spoke first, acknowledging that the wedding incident had been poorly judged and that he had underestimated how public gestures shape private relationships. His words steadier than before, and Chloe followed, admitting that what she had framed as humor had caused unintended harm, though her tone carried a hint of lingering defensiveness that Margaret noticed without reacting. Margaret folded her hands on the conference table and spoke calmly, not recounting humiliation but articulating expectation, stating that financial support is an extension of shared values, and that respect must be visible, not assumed, especially in moments designed to celebrate family. She clarified that independence, which Daniel had emphasized during his speech, includes accountability for choices, and that public dismissal cannot coexist comfortably with private reliance. Harrison then reviewed a proposed path forward, outlining conditions under which support might gradually resume, including a written acknowledgement of the trust standards and a commitment to direct communication regarding future decisions involving shared resources. The conversation remained civil, punctuated by thoughtful pauses rather than raised voices, and as Daniel reviewed the document, Margaret observed a subtle shift in his posture, the rigidity softening into consideration. Chloe nodded, though more slowly, and agreed to the outlined terms, recognizing that clarity now would prevent greater strain later. When the meeting concluded, Margaret rose without haste, offering a small, restrained smile that signaled neither victory nor surrender but equilibrium. And as they walked together toward the elevator, she sensed that the balance of their relationship had adjusted not through spectacle but through structure. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and Margaret stepped into the crisp air with quiet assurance, aware that dignity maintained consistently speaks more powerfully than any reaction delivered in the moment. The weeks that followed the meeting unfolded with a quieter rhythm, measured not by confrontation, but by subtle adjustments in tone and behavior, and Margaret observed the changes with careful attention rather than expectation. Daniel began calling every Sunday evening, not out of obligation but with deliberate presence, asking about her garden, her book club discussions, and the small repairs she had mentioned around the house. And while the conversations remained slightly formal at first, they carried a sincerity that had been absent in recent years. Chloe, too, made an effort, sending a handwritten note 2 weeks after their return, acknowledging that humor, when misplaced, can wound rather than entertain, and expressing a desire to rebuild trust gradually rather than assume it automatically. Margaret read the letter at the kitchen table beneath the soft light fixture, her reading glasses resting low on her nose, and she noted that the language was careful but genuine, not defensive, not dismissive. The trust review proceeded according to the outlined conditions, with Harrison Cole confirming that a portion of the suspended support would be reinstated incrementally over the next 6 months, contingent upon continued alignment with the standards previously discussed, and Daniel accepted the structure without resistance, understanding now that financial stewardship is intertwined with relational responsibility. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel and Chloe drove to Westport and joined Margaret for lunch at a small waterfront restaurant overlooking the marina, the air crisp and bright, sailboats rocking gently against their slips, and the conversation flowed more naturally than it had in some time. Daniel apologized directly, not for perception but for inaction, admitting that he had prioritized comfort over courage in a moment that required both, and Margaret listened without dramatizing the exchange, simply acknowledging that accountability strengthens character when it is embraced rather than avoided. Chloe maintained steady eye contact and spoke of future gatherings with clearer consideration, suggesting that the next holiday be hosted at Margaret's home if she wished, an offer that signaled inclusion rather than convenience. As they parted in the late afternoon sunlight, Margaret watched their car disappear down the quiet street and felt neither triumph nor vindication, only steadiness. The balance had shifted not because she had raised her voice, but because she had clarified her boundaries and allowed them space to respond. And as she returned inside to water the hydrangeas once more, she understood that dignity, once defended thoughtfully, reshapes relationships in ways spectacle never can. Autumn settled fully over Westport by the time the first holiday invitation arrived from Daniel and Chloe, printed on thick cream cardstock and mailed rather than texted, a small gesture that Margaret noticed immediately as she stood by the front door sorting through envelopes. The card invited her to Thanksgiving dinner at their condominium in Greenwich, specifying the time, the menu, and even a request for her cranberry recipe, details that suggested intention rather than afterthought. She placed the invitation on the hallway table beneath the framed photograph of Thomas and allowed herself a measured pause, recognizing that reconciliation is not declared in grand speeches but demonstrated in consistent choices. On Thanksgiving afternoon, she arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, carrying a glass dish wrapped in a linen towel, and when Chloe opened the door, she stepped aside without hesitation, greeting Margaret warmly and guiding her toward the dining room, where a place card bearing her full name rested beside Daniel's at the head of the table. There were no exaggerated gestures, no theatrical apologies, only quiet inclusion that felt deliberate. During dinner, Daniel spoke about work projects and future plans with thoughtful consideration, occasionally glancing toward his mother as if to ensure she was fully part of the conversation rather than an observer at its edge. Chloe asked Margaret about her book club selection and listened without interruption, and the evening unfolded with a steadiness that contrasted sharply with the spectacle of months earlier. After dessert, Daniel cleared the plates and returned with coffee, setting a cup before his mother with a simple nod that conveyed understanding more clearly than words might have. Later, as coats were gathered and goodbyes exchanged in the hallway, Chloe thanked Margaret for coming and for her patience, acknowledging that rebuilding trust requires time and humility, and Margaret responded that clarity often strengthens relationships when it is received with openness. Driving home beneath bare maple trees illuminated by streetlights, she reflected on how boundaries, once articulated calmly, create space for growth rather than division. She did not consider the evening a triumph, nor did she erase what had occurred in the past, but she recognized progress in the details, the placement of a chair, the tone of a voice, the consistency of follow-through. As she entered her quiet home and placed her keys in the porcelain dish by the door, she understood that dignity preserved through restraint can influence outcomes more profoundly than confrontation ever could, and she felt a quiet confidence that the legacy she and Thomas built would endure not through control, but through example. Winter arrived quietly in Westport, settling over rooftops and bare branches with a soft layer of snow that muted the neighborhood into calm. And by early December, Margaret noticed that the rhythm of her relationship with Daniel and Chloe had shifted from careful correction to steady consistency. Daniel continued his Sunday calls without fail, sometimes discussing work, sometimes asking about small repairs around the house, and occasionally sharing reflections that suggested he had been thinking deeply about leadership and responsibility within his marriage. One evening, he admitted that the public independence he once celebrated had been more about proving something than understanding something, and Margaret listened without interrupting, allowing him the space to articulate lessons in his own words rather than supplying them for him. Chloe, too, demonstrated change through action rather than performance, inviting Margaret to join them for a small holiday concert in Greenwich and sending her drafts of seating arrangements for upcoming gatherings with a light-hearted note that said, "We would not dare forget your place," which carried humility without defensiveness. Margaret accepted these gestures not as repayment but as restoration, aware that trust rebuilt slowly tends to endure. At the end of the year, Harrison Cole confirmed that the trust review had been successfully completed, noting compliance with the outlined standards and recommending that discretionary support resume in full under the established framework, and Margaret approved the reinstatement without ceremony, recognizing that structure had accomplished what emotion alone could not. On Christmas Eve, Daniel and Chloe arrived at her home carrying wrapped gifts and a small evergreen centerpiece, and as they gathered around the oak dining table Thomas had once refinished, the atmosphere felt grounded rather than performative. There were no exaggerated apologies, no references to the past, only steady conversation, shared laughter, and a visible effort to ensure inclusion in every detail. Later that night, after they had left and the house returned to its quiet stillness, Margaret stood by the living room window watching snow settle softly under the porch light, reflecting on how dignity, once maintained under pressure, becomes a compass rather than a shield. She understood that what had shifted was not merely financial arrangement or social courtesy, but clarity about roles, about mutual respect, and about the quiet authority that comes from remaining composed when invited to react. As she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, she felt not vindicated but aligned, aware that legacy is shaped less by dramatic responses and more by the steady insistence that respect is never optional, even within family. By early spring, the air along the Connecticut shoreline softened, and the first pale green leaves began to reappear on the maple trees outside Margaret's home, signaling not just a change in season, but a quiet completion of something far less visible. Nearly 6 months had passed since that evening in the ballroom, and the distance between humiliation and restoration now felt measured rather than raw, defined by consistent actions instead of dramatic declarations. Daniel and Chloe had settled into a rhythm of deliberate inclusion, not extravagant gestures, but steady respect, invitations extended in advance, conversations that welcomed Margaret's perspective without defensiveness, and acknowledgments that felt earned rather than rehearsed. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel arrived alone, carrying a folder of financial documents and a simple request for guidance regarding a long-term investment decision. And as they sat at the oak table Thomas had refinished years earlier, he listened carefully while Margaret reviewed the numbers, explaining risk tolerance, long-term growth, and the importance of maintaining liquidity, her voice calm and assured. He thanked her not only for the advice but for the example she had set, admitting that strength expressed quietly had taught him more than any argument might have, and Margaret accepted the gratitude with a restrained nod, aware that lessons absorbed voluntarily endure longer than those imposed. Chloe later joined them for dinner, bringing fresh bread from a local bakery and setting the table with thoughtful attention, ensuring Margaret's place was centered and unobstructed, a small detail that spoke more loudly than apology ever could. The evening unfolded without tension, the conversation moving naturally from travel plans to neighborhood updates, and Margaret noticed how Daniel deferred to her when recounting family stories, including her perspective as part of the narrative rather than a footnote to it. After they left, she walked through the quiet house and paused in the study, resting her hand briefly on the leather-bound portfolio that had once symbolized leverage but now represented structure and foresight. She understood that what had shifted was not authority imposed from above but alignment restored through clarity. Standing by the living room window as the last light of day reflected across the sound, Margaret reflected that dignity is rarely defended in a single moment. It is upheld through consistency, restraint, and the willingness to let actions speak where emotion might falter. She did not revisit the image of a misplaced seat with bitterness, nor did she erase it from memory. Instead, she regarded it as a turning point that revealed the necessity of boundaries and the quiet power of composure. As evening settled and the porch light flickered on automatically, she felt no need to prove anything further. Her place within the family was no longer defined by a chair in a ballroom, but by the steady presence she maintained, and in that understanding, she found a lasting peace that required neither spectacle nor applause.